Again, I'm Steve Stone, currently with the MITRE Corporation, and I'd like to talk to you today about some research I did in agility and decision-making for cyberspace operations. And I do have to say that while I work for the MITRE Corporation, I'm using their logo. This work was done independently at Robert Morris University, and so what I say here today, if you disagree, it's my fault, not the MITRE Corporation's. So we know that the U.S. military has a long history of successful operations in the physical domain. And from that experience, we've got a lot of military doctrine, particularly in command and control doctrine, on how we command and control forces in the physical domain. And a lot of that's been evolved, and the current doctrine developed since World War II, and refined in Vietnam and in the Gulf War, and even back in the Cold War. And now we've moved to operations in the cyberspace domain. And sort of my hypothesis that cyberspace is different, being a man-made domain, and it's particularly different in the dimensions of time and space when compared to the physical domain. And I'm an old armored cavalry officer way back in the day, where I knew that if I picked a particular hilltop to defend as key terrain, I could put my tanks there, and I had to pay attention to what was maybe within about 4 or 5 kilometers of me. And if somebody was outside of that range, it was going to take a certain amount of time for them to get to me, so I had time to react. All makes sense. Now, what really got me started on this idea was an article that Major General Brett Williams wrote in National Defense Review, well, I think it was 2014. It said, hey, we're going to identify cyber key terrain, and in some cases we're going to defend this cyber key terrain, and we're going to accept risk in this other cyber key terrain. And as an old armored cavalry guy, I'm going, okay, I know what those terms mean in the physical domain, but I really don't understand what they mean in the cyber domain. Because I could accept risk in key terrain that's halfway around the world, and we know that that's milliseconds at most of maneuver distance. So these concepts of time and space are very different in the cyber domain. Yet what we're doing, understandably, from the long history of operations in the physical domain, is we're trying to take that doctrine, our command and control methodologies from the physical domain, and apply them in the cyber domain. And I'm one of those guys. I retired from the Army in 2006, first started working in this area at U.S. Central Command, then at the 5th Signal Command in Germany, and then later at JTF GNO. And I'm the guy at one point who was writing the old NetOps, ConOps for DoD back in 2003, 2004 that said, hey, here's how we're going to apply our current command and control doctrine out of Joint Pub 3 to what we would now call cyberspace operations. And after several years of watching us say, well, this is a COCOM specific issue, and so CENTCOM's in charge. Wait, this is a global issue. So in that day, STRATCOM's in charge. I watched it not work very well. And so that really started me thinking about what's different here. And one of the things I just put up here, some things here. If you look at the command and control chart there on your left, that's the Pacific Theater in World War II. With Nimitz and MacArthur and all those sorts of things, organized geographically or by domain. Right? And if you look at the other one, that's a really early command and control chart for some of the cyber command things, and they look a lot alike. So part of my hypothesis is maybe this isn't the right way to do command and control for cyberspace. Now, unfortunately for me, as I was starting this research, there's this guy named Admiral Rogers, you may have heard of him, who published the same statement. And it's really nice when the 4-star agrees with your hypothesis right before you do some research. And he said, our traditional command and control and operational constructs do not enable the speed and agility required to keep pace with the change in the cyber domain. I appreciate Admiral Rogers agreeing with me right then as I started to work on this research question. And that research question is, what factors are related to the U.S. military's agility and allocating decision-making rights for cyberspace operations? And you ask the question, why allocating decision-making rights? And I'll talk to you about that here in a minute. So this is a pretty knowledgeable group. I probably don't need to go over this, but does anybody need an explanation of where our current cyberspace operations doctrine is? Okay. I don't think so. I'm getting a lot of nods, so I'll skip this one. But anytime you're doing research, it's important to understand or have a theoretical framework from which you're going to base your research on. And I think many of you know Dr. David Alberts, currently at IDA, previously in the DoD CIO, and Dr. Rich Hayes from Evidence-Based Research, who for many years have run the Department of Defense Command and Control Research Program in its various phases. And we went out and looked at the literature and said, what is a theoretical model of command and control that we could use? This model, Dr. Albert's model, jumped out as really the only practical alternative that's out there. And this is an academic definition, not an operational one, but if you look, and I'll describe the cube here. In theory, this cube describes all possible command and control arrangements could be based on this cube. So let me give a little bit of a description. So across the horizontal axis of this cube is the allocation of decision-making rights. How do either individuals, commanders, or organizations make decisions, and how is that going to be distributed? And it goes from the origin, where it's a unitary-based decision-making process. One person makes all the decisions. To at the far end of the axis is a peer-to-peer, almost democratic decision-making process, if you will, where everyone has equal decision-making rights. My personal opinion, and the reason we chose the agility of decision-making rights or allocation of decision-making rights axis was this is the most important of the three. Along the vertical axis, you have patterns of information distribution. How do we share information from being tightly controlled at the origin to unconstrained, where everybody has access to everything? And then on the axis, the z-axis in the depth, talks about how do organizations interact, also being from very tightly controlled to broad, collaborative type of interactions across the organization. So Alberts and Hayes have hypothesized that our current command and control, the way we've been doing things in the physical domain, is very much located in this box at the origin. We have unitary decision-making, tightly controlled information distribution, and pretty constrained interactions. And if you look at our current command and control doctrine, we start to specify command relationships and decision authorities. We have combatant command authority over his forces, who he delegates operational control to various forces. That's not a wrong view, that our current command and control models are somewhere in that box at the origin. At the other extreme, which Alberts and Hayes call an edge organization, you have peer-to-peer decision-making, unconstrained information sharing, and really collaborative interactions. So this provided at least a theoretical model to look at the problem. And again, you pick the allocation of decision-making rights as being the most important axis of this particular model. So any questions on that before I move on? I think you could apply this model to a crowdsourcing concept, and it would be out there in what Dave Alberts would call an edge organization. Unconstrained decision-making is made by the masses. Everybody has access to all the information, shares it broadly. So we're seeing some of this in the, our cyber-enabled business operations and other sorts of things. Any other questions? Colonel Cutworth.
So with the Z-axis, that's with different organizations, whereas the X-axis or the Y-axis is shared information. So if sharing information so that's why the Z-axis is different.
So the question about was the distribution of information only within your organization. And I think the distribution of information would be within the context of whatever problem you're looking at. It could be within a small unit. It could be a team. That's one way you could apply this model to it and look at how they share information, all the way up to the national strategic level and how do we share information across all the parties at play. I will say this, not a part of this talk, but we are working on some further research to look at this model and how it would apply at different levels of operations for cyberspace. Again, at the team level, at perhaps the operational level, the JFHQ level, or the service component level, and then what works up at the national strategic level. The model fits for all three. What we hypothesize, we're going to find very different answers for what we our current practice in each of those dimensions at each of those levels. Any other questions? Of course, as an academic, you have to describe the methodology that you used in your research design. So we looked at this kind of problem. We decided to use the Delphi method, and it's not widely known, but the Delphi method was developed at the Rand Corporation in the early 50s to look at the effect of technology, in that case particularly nuclear weapons, on warfare. It's really designed for a pragmatic research question, something you want to apply, find an answer to an applied question right now. And it's also very useful in an area where there's been little research done. And I said we have a lot of research in command and control, but at the time we did this research, and even today, very, very little research in how do you do command and control for cyber. So that's why we chose that method. Our sampling, how did I find participants for this? One, I have to give props to the Military Cyber Professionals Association. Back at the time, Joe Billingsley allowed me to use the MCPA membership list to solicit participants in this research. We also use a number of other professional contacts, and we really targeted cyber operations professionals that we described as somebody with an advanced technical degree and at least 5 or more years of operational experience in something we could call cyberspace operations right now. The data analysis was quantitative. We looked at a number of things, the normal standard tendencies, the mean, standard deviation, those sorts of things. And for this purpose, we decided to use what we call now a modified Delphi study. In the traditional Delphi method, the very first round is you survey all your participants and give them an open-ended question saying, tell me what's important about this topic. Because of the lack of research in this area and the fact that there was some limited time to get this done, we said, let's use a modified technique where the first round we actually proposed some factors that we thought were worthwhile for considering. And then we went through and our panel, which had about 35 participants in this. The panel went through and ranked the importance of those factors as whether they were relevant or not relevant to cyberspace operations. In the second round, they ranked the importance of those. And then in the third round, we tried to rack and stack and prioritize the factors that were identified, and that ran into some interesting challenges that I'll talk about here in a minute. And then of course, we did the analysis of the results and published those. So when we first started for the first round of this research, what we did is a survey of the literature in the area of command and control, and more broadly in decision-making, and said, right, what are the kinds of factors we might be considered, or we want to consider, as we think about how to be agile in decision-making for any type of operation, but in particular cyberspace. So see the first couple there are traditional military command and control things, right at a Joint Pub 3. Commanders, authorities, and relationships, the mission, commander's intent, time, all the sorts of things that those of us who've been in and around the military are used to in planning. We also looked a bit more broadly than just things from the DoD context. We look at a lot of business literature. Some other areas, there's an interesting area called Naturalistic Decision-Making that looks at how emergency responders and people in time-critical circumstances make decisions. We looked at even some of the early pioneers in decision-making research. Look at John Galbraith and Peter Drucker and some others. Surveyed all that literature and came up with this list of 32 factors to propose initially to the panel. And again, some of the non-traditional military types of things I'll call out. One was particularly individual relationships. Who do individuals know and how do they relate with them, as opposed to our organizational relationships, which our command and control doctrine is built on. We looked at some concepts out of big data, information volume, velocity, those sorts of things, variety. A number of things about organizational design, about where's the expertise, where's the knowledge, what is the role of the first line leader. So some things come from non-traditional areas other than DoD command and control. So those went out in the first round survey and said, tell me what's relevant, what's not relevant for command and control of cyberspace operations. The research panel was also invited then to propose additional factors that we had not included in the first round survey. So out of those came up some interesting ones that we did the analysis on the free responses we got back. We normalized those down to these 11 factors. One is how well is the synchronization between kinetic operations, operations in the kinetic domain, and the cyberspace operations. The idea of decentralization, how decentralized is our operation? Domain integration was one that was defined. How well are the various operational domains, air, land, sea space, cyberspace, integrated? Of course, I don't know why I forgot this one, saying that in our initial survey, saying all of our command and control doctrines based on geographic boundaries, but that one came up as what are the geographic boundaries for the operation we're working on? Another big difference in the cyberspace domain compared to the physical domain is what's the role of the private sector? And that was an interesting one. So anyway, out of these 11, we now had a collection of 43 factors to go out and rank the importance of. So we did that, and then we tried to rack and stack them, and what we got was this prioritized list of 21 factors. In theory, the most important factors we should consider when thinking about agility and decision-making for cyberspace operations. Not surprisingly, we had a large population, about half of the panel were either active duty military or former military. So some of the military to command and control things came to the top. Commander's intent, situational awareness, command authorities and relationships. Clearly, legal authorities and rules of engagement were near the top of the list. But we also came up, I'm going to step around here, can't read it clearly. Some other things that came up, number 12 there, information velocity. How fast is the information moving? A big data concept. Real-time operational changes, number 14, dealt with how quickly are the circumstances you're operating in changing. Anyway, so we came up with this rank of 21 factors. Yes, sir.
It's interesting. It seems like you're kind of going around the edge of it in a couple of places, but I didn't see attribution on like, is that an outside the scope?
So it wasn't one that came up in this context with the actual allocation of decision-making rights. I think, and again, we only looked at one dimension of that model, which is actually a limitation of this research. If you looked at distribution of information, I would expect the attribution, what do we know about the actors, would pop up there, but it didn't pop up in this survey. Any other questions on this?
Difference between authorities and
So the question was there a difference, or do we draw a difference between authorities and permissions, and not in this context? Again, we had touched in a couple places. We had command authorities in our normal command and control doctrine sorts of things. And then we also had legal authorities and rules of engagement was where we drew that. I think many of you know my own experience working in ops and observing ops recently is the lawyer is the hardest working person on the ops floor. So the legal authorities piece really came in high. And one of the things that, again, not the topic of this talk, there's another paper in the works. When we compared the answers by demographics, started to look at some very interesting differences. And one of those came out between folks with military experience, either being active duty or retired folks, and those without military experience. Vastly different responses. I'll tell you one of the things, the legal authorities and rules of engagement one for the folks with military experience was number one. And that group of either 12 or 13, I don't remember exactly how it's split right now. In the civilian side, it was like number 42. So there were some very significant differences in responses based on some of the demographics. And for those of you who are statisticians, if you look at some of these other columns here, between the mean, the standard deviation, the mode, and the range, I put those on there because this actually showed something that surprised me in the final results when we tried to rank order all the factors that we had identified. We actually couldn't do it with any statistical credibility. If you look at the first one, just for example, we had a mean of 4.68. It's still the highest ranked one. But you look at the standard deviation of 4.84, or was that 4.85, it's even bigger than the average. So we had a lot of variability in the responses. And we started to look at that, and that's actually what pointed to the let's slice these by demographics and see what the differences are. But what it also said is these things are highly correlated. And we actually ran all the factors through a correlation analysis. It's about 1,300 pairs of comparison, and about 10% of them turned out to be highly correlated between the two, which actually, in hindsight, it's not something I anticipated at the start of the research, but it certainly made sense afterwards that a lot of these factors may overlap a bit. In fact, one of the observations after we completed the analysis is some of these factors here, in fact, one of the information was like information velocity there at number 12. That actually may be more appropriately aligned with the distribution of information access to this model. So there's a lot more research to be done in this area. Any further questions on this chart? So when we're all done, I mean, I'll be honest, this is just some very initial exploratory research into this area of command and control for cyberspace. There's a lot more to do still. But we did at least provide an initial list of some prioritized factors for decision makers to consider when designing a command and control process for cyberspace operations. And some of those are actually out of the non-traditional command and control doctrine, if you will. So it's a little bit broader than what we normally think of when we think about command and control. Again, I said lots of work still to be done. One of the first ones really is to really examine why are these factors so highly intercorrelated. And I think to do that, it really requires a similar type study across the other two axes of this particular model. One of the things we looked at, but it wasn't statistically possible, there's a statistical technique called the factor analysis, which lets you take multiple factors and statistically neck them down into fewer. Certainly a valid methodology. My sample size wasn't big enough to actually conduct that analysis, because I think with some rigor you could collapse the 43 we started with or the 21 we ended up with into maybe 6 or 7 more, concise factors than what we have. There's a causality question. This didn't identify what were the causes of the results here, just the fact that these were identified as being relevant. What is the causality between them? How would they, an individual factor here, change the agility of an actual command and control model? Some of that is some research that we're proposing to do, hopefully sometime soon. And then I mentioned already we need to do the research on the other two axes of the model. So I think out of time, but are there any more questions? All right, well, thank you all very much.